This is Duke University.
All black, everything black, culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back, black.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Professor Regina Bradley and Professor Julius Bailey to talk about the new book, The Cultural Impact of Kanye West, a new book just published by Palgrave Macmillan, edited by Julius Bailey, who's also the editor of the 2011 collection, Jay-Z, The Philosopher King. How are you both doing today?
I'm doing great, sir. I appreciate the invitation and the exciting opportunity we have this afternoon.
So in some ways, a book about Kanye West sort of sells itself. You know, he's an interesting figure in that he's this interesting mix between kind of celebrity culture and artist with a capital A. Talk a little bit, Julius, about your interest in Kanye West and pulling together this volume.
Sure. Well, I mean, I couldn't have done it, obviously, without the fine colleagues as yourself and Regina, but a number of colleagues who had very learned ideas about how Kanye's impact affects the world. Mm-hmm. For me, it was a pedagogical tool. I mean, I started as teaching a class, a freshman seminar on how not to be a college dropout. And so that's how I started. And so in the course of preparing the class, I was just digging real deep in the education trilogy. And over the course of 16 weeks, every week, the students would bring me out more questions and more ideas, and I started writing notes, and then eventually I would call on you guys. You all would have ideas, and I said, you know what, I got too many ideas out there. Let me just ask all you guys to help me make this happen, and you all graciously made it happen into a volume that I'm not only proud of, but I fundamentally think it's going to serve as a foundation for education and hip-hop pedagogy in America.
Now, Julius, you're trained as a philosopher. Talk a little bit of what it's like, first of all, as a philosopher, to engage hip-hop in this way. But, you know, what are some of your colleagues at Wittenberg thinking about, you know, their philosophy colleague writing about Kanye West?
It's a challenge, brother. It is. So, I mean, I have to, you know, always wear my intellectual hat and dig in the crates, as you would say, but dig in the philosophical crates and make sure they understand that it is not an anomaly, right? And so, you know, we elevate the, you know, Socrates and Plato, you know, in philosophy. But if we really understand the workings of the ancient Greeks, I mean, they were as crazy as Kanye might be. I mean, they drunk, they mistreated women. They had these, you know, wild ideas about art and society. And I think hip hop does the same thing. Not necessarily mistreat women per se, but there are aspects of it that, you know, that certainly do that. But I've honestly had to prove and justify what the canon looks like and how this modern day student responds to the canon. So real quickly, I mean, for me, I start every classroom, every day in every class, no matter whether it's a seminar on Kant or whether it's an intro to logic. What are you listening to today? What are you plugged into that can inform the way in which we go about this class? And even though I teach at a predominantly white institution, it is you know, mostly hip hop that does it. So it's by no mistake that I use hip hop as a pedagogical tool, and it works for me.
Professor Bradley, your contribution to this new book is a piece called Kanye West's Sonic Cosmopolitanism. Talk a little bit about your piece.
Well, first, I just want to say, Mama, I made it on Left to Black. But yeah, so actually, where I got my idea from was from your book, Mark, about illegible Black masculinities in your chapter, your manifesto on Jay-Z. And it was really interesting for me to think about, you know, Kanye often says that, no, I do hip hop, but I'm bigger than that. I'm like a rock star figure. So it's like, how do I use this idea of being this rock star figure to think about his contribution to not only hip hop, but just cultural studies in general. And I came up with this idea of the way that he manipulates sound. If there's one thing that we know Kanye for, is for the way that he tinkers with sound. So his sonic narrative was particularly interesting to me and really hasn't been discussed in the way that I played around with it in this chapter, and thinking about the ways that he uses sound to kind of remove himself from these boxes that often are accompanying hip hop culture in terms of gender and gender performance.
Now, Regina, your work primarily is looking at what I guess we could call the post-civil rights South, the new South, if you will. You know, how does Kanye fit into this larger narrative around Southern culture and black masculinity at this point in time?
I mean, it's really interesting because on the one hand, I want to applaud him because he has roots in Atlanta. And then, there's that little piece of attachment to contemporary Southern politics there. But then he comes out, with this Confederate flag on his arm. And I'm like, guy, really, guy? That kind of just dismisses all of the agency associated with what that represents for Southern black folks. I mean, I think Pastor Troy was like, he doesn't understand what the significance of that flag is. Yeah. And I have to kind of agree. It's really fascinating to me the way that he tries to blur these discourses or these conversations between history, the present, and he said that he reclaimed the flag. And I'm like, that's really interesting how you try to reclaim something that wasn't necessarily for us in the first place. But, he really kind of helps to think about these different ways that black masculinity plays out in contemporary spaces that have been historicized in such a traumatic way, like the South.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Professor Regina Bradley, as well as Professor Julius Bailey. Professor Bailey is the editor of the new collection, The Cultural Impact of Kanye West, just published by Palgrave Macmillan. One of the things that has come up in conversations about Kanye, and Kanye has said it himself, he really thinks of himself as a musical genius. Again, if there are fine lines that might distinguish him from, say, his colleague, friend, big brother Jay-Z, Jay-Z is a good hip hop artist and a good marketer, a good promoter of himself and what have you. But Kanye, we get the feeling that if he didn't have the platform of hip hop and have an international stage, he would be someplace tinkering with sound the way that he's done all of his life. What do you say to folks, and I've heard this a lot, when they look at someone like Kanye, particularly the kinds of things with the Confederate flag or any numerous things that Kanye has done over the last decade to draw attention to himself, what do you say to those folks like, well, how can we consider this guy a genius? What's genius about the work that Kanye does?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I mean, I'm not, I don't throw around that term too often, right? And so for me, I think if we associate genius with just the ability to elevate a consciousness that's rooted with, with sort of the grounding of the earth, right? So when Regina talks about in her chapter the idea of his cosmopolitanism, but it's also linked with sort of an urban sound, right? So I think if there's a genius associated with him, I think it's in what the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche would say, a transvaluation of values, right? I mean, he sort of changes the narrative in terms of what we look at and what we identify as good, right? Or what is moral, right? And not just in terms of action, but also in artistry, right? So, I mean, he pushes the proverbial envelope when it comes to what is good art up against what is good sound, right? And I think that's exactly what the work of Friedrich Nietzsche does in terms of trying to, break away from provincial structures in philosophy, and Kanye becomes this sort of hip hop deconstructionist, if you will.
I mean, to add on to that, though, too, I think what folks need to realize is that we're in a different moment in hip-hop. Like, a lot of folks want to say the kind of this romanticized concept, hip-hop should do this, hip-hop should do that. But what I try to push in my chapter and even in my work outside of the Kanye book and project is that we're living in a hyper-commodified moment in how we understand race and identity, and the things that we see normally or hyped up in such a way that we're continuously bombarded with that is what Kanye West plays on. Like, I talked to my students about this. We had a Google Hangout a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about how, the climate was different when he came out with the College Dropout in 2004, and it was like he was trying to introduce this idea that there's a different way of approaching ideas of the American dream and ideas of masculinity.
Education, right.
Right, and departing from that in ways that speak to this particular moment. And even from 10 years ago to the present, there's been yet another shift, because not only are we dealing with, President Obama, he's the first black president. Yeah, we got that. But now we're in a post-Trayvon, post-Jordan Davis. What does that mean in terms of masculinity and how we frame that in these popular spaces? And as much as Kanye gets on folks' nerves, that's still an entry point for many people into thinking about the complicated ways to address what this means.
Yeah, and so I think that is very rich in terms of what Kanye attempts to do, right? So I mean, he's at one level, people see him as this sort of ultra celebrity, right? I mean, moving himself into this privileged class. But as we saw in the Yeezus album, right, in you know, his conversation about that, you know, I mean, there is a such thing as broke brother racism, right? And then there's rich brother racism, right? And so this broke brother racism he talked about in the college dropout, right?
Right.
And then now there's rich brother racism in which he's trying to, you know, gain access to a world in which is still trying to push him back. So his blackness, if you will, is still coming to fore, irrespective of what type of economic bracket he finds himself in. And so, you know, Regina, when you said earlier about what he's trying to do, I mean, the great post-structuralist writer Homi Bhabha says this idea about, you know, he's engaged in what, you know, Homi Bhabha would say is sort of a colonial mimicry, right? I mean, he's doing that, right? And so, you know, how do we accept that and understand that within the proverbial understanding of white supremacy, and look at Kanye as a post-colonial subject attempting to navigate through that consciousness?
You know, just listening to you, Professor Bailey, you know, it makes me want to ask the two of you another kind of question that's a little broader than just talking about Kanye. You know, I, of course, have been fortunate the last couple of years to co-teach a class, you know, here at Duke with Ninth Wonder. You know, his new film, the new documentary, the first documentary, The Wonder Years, came out a few years ago, a new documentary called, you know, The Hip Hop Fellow, you know, chronicling his year as a hip hop fellow at Harvard, traveling back and forth from Duke, you know, up to Cambridge. And it's a very new moment, because one of the things that the film is putting into focus is that we no longer have to create a space for hip hop to be in the academy, and we no longer have to validate why hip hop needs to be in the academy. What does that conversation look like now in 2014, when suddenly folks, you know, don't have to look, you know, over their shoulders about whether or not somebody's coming, the hip hop police or the academic police are coming and saying, right, because it goes both ways, right? It's the folks more broadly in a hip hop community who are questioning why this work is being done in the academy and who's doing that work in the academy. By the same token, the academy is looking at it as like, well, you know, is this even viable, right? Is this something that produces knowledge and knowledge that needs to be circulated? You know, what does that look like for the both of you in 2014?
You got it, Julius.
No, that's cool. No, I mean, you know, I appreciate the fact that you have institutions that, I mean, like, when you bring a Ninth Wonder in the classroom, right? I mean, that assists those of us who do the work, right? And so we know that when artists then sign on to what we're doing, right, then that helps the academic do their thing, right? So historically, I mean, you know, from Trisha Rose's work to, you know, Dyson's work to your work, you know, earlier, I mean, we, you know, you all were hitting up against that ceiling, right? Yeah, where you're pushing through academia, but then even, I'm sure you still had some of the hip hop artists like, man, them cats don't know what the hell going on. You know what I'm saying? They ain't real to this. You know, they're sitting behind some ivory tower. But then as we move forward and seeing individuals like Jay-Z and Nas and Bun B and all these folk institutionalizing themselves, I think now we're really pushing and making and forging what I like to call, and I'm glad you crafted this way, a hip hop community that I can feel a part of, because I'm too fat to be a break dancer, right? I wasn't a DJ. I'm an academic, man. And so, you know, it's good to know that I have artists that's saying, Bailey, you know, we appreciate your work. We appreciate you taking us seriously. And I think that's in large part due to the type of connections you and others have done in the academy over the past, 20 years.
Regina.
I'm gonna take it from a slightly different approach. One of the ways that I think that we have to readdress what, you know, hip hop in the academy looks like is to actually extend these conversations outside of the ivory tower. And the way to do that is through social media, new media. That's the way that I approach it in my own work. It's a lot easier to try to include these artists and performers in the conversation when you actually can reach out to them on Twitter and be like, yo, I'm thinking about X, Y, and Z. What do you think, right? To actually show that they're opinion is valid outside of the space of hip hop as a space of performance.
Yeah, I mean, talk a little bit, Regina, as you're talking about these kind of new media and digital media spaces. I mean, you've been doing this project, recently around, outcasted, having these conversations with scholars about, when they had that moment when you were outcasted, when outcast really hit you. So talk a little bit about moving towards this kind of space to do the kind of work that you're doing.
Oh man, I appreciate you shouting out the project, Mark. So what I'm doing right now is the 20th anniversary of Outkast in hip hop. So I came up with this idea called Outcasted Conversations. It's still pretty new in the game, but we're booked until October, so I'm really excited. But what I'm trying to do is actually, when we talk about the Academy, an additional part of that is thinking about the ways that we can archive these types of conversations to kind of set the premise for future scholars. When you were coming up in the 90s, I was still trying to figure out where I fit into hip hop, and now that I consider myself a hip hop scholar, it's like, how do I connect my experiences to my work? And the way to do that is through social media. So one of the ways that I utilize that is to use it as a type of cultural archive, meaning that I'm trying to find a way to think about this particular moment by capturing this moment, and also thinking about the ways to use it to attach what's happened previously and what happens in the future, because I'm pretty sure new social media is not going anywhere. And there'll be a way to, there'll be something totally different. We might have Twitter now, and there might be something you just think about it, and then it just pops up on the internet somewhere. So I just really find that really useful in terms of my research in contemporary cultural expression, to find ways to reach out. And it's so much easier to reach out now, so I use that to ground my work.
We've been joined today by Professor Regina Bradley, also joined by Professor Julius Bailey. Professor Bailey is the editor of the new collection, The Cultural Impact of Kanye West, just published by Palgrave Macmillan. Thank you, boy, for joining us today.
Cop that joint.
Take care, folks.
All right, thank you for having us, Mark.
And thank you, sir, very much.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black, everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back, black.